So, as we start to move into the sermon series, I get the benefit of kicking this off. And as a means of an access point to enter this sermon series, I want to talk to you about photography. And one of the things is when photography is done really well, when that image is captured well, it clarifies the image for us. It reveals the beauty of what has been captured. And when it's done really, really, really well, we almost get invited into the world of that image. And one of the ways that photographers do this is they use lens filters for their cameras. And these filters, they'll let certain types of light in and they'll filter out other types of light. They'll let certain types of colors in and filter out other types of colors. And that's what makes the picture pop. It's what helps us to connect with it. And so, as we think about this sermon series, what we want to do is engage in some of that lens and filter switching, because whether we know it or not, every single one of us reads the Bible through a lens, reads it through a filter of some sort, and we let certain meanings come in and we filter out other meanings. And part of the challenge is to recognize the fact that we actually have filters. I hear people say sometimes, oh, well, I just follow the Bible. That doesn't actually happen, because every time we approach the text, we approach it through a lens, through a set of experiences, through a set of commitments that we have theologically. We have all of those that we approach the text with, and we need to recognize that. One of the gifts of the Reformation was this doctrine of sola scriptura that Luther brought forth to us. And in sola scriptura, what Luther is trying to do is trying to say we have a tradition, a Roman Catholic tradition, and we've got a text. And what we need to do is to create some space between those two things so that we can actually allow that text to speak back to the lens, to speak back to the tradition and inform it. And the irony, though, is that we've kind of come to a place where we think we can read it without a lens altogether. And so the challenge in this sermon series is to get to a place where we can separate that lens and actually let the text talk back to it, maybe change it, maybe shift it a little bit, and to see some theological points, to see some biblical passages that we've read over and over again in a slightly different light. So the first thing that I want to talk about that I think is really important is to talk about this idea of salvation. What do we mean when we say that we're saved or God is doing a saving work in our lives? And to get at this, I think we need to start with what is most likely the lens we begin with. And it's not true of everyone, but I work at a conservative evangelical organization, and most people that I talk to and interact with tend to see salvation as something that God does to us spiritually. God is going to save our souls, and that's something that's going to happen in the future. And so it's this sort of ethereal concept that doesn't really happen now. It's actually something that's going to happen to us in the future. And what I want to argue is that while that's a part of it, that there is this future aspect of salvation, it's just that. It's only a part of it. There is a much deeper, much more profound notion of salvation that we experience in Scripture. And so to take a look at that, I want to look at Luke chapter 8, verses 43 through 48. And this is the story of the woman who had been bleeding. And if you want to read along with me, I'm going to start at verse 43. A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had spent her entire livelihood on doctors, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the hem of his clothes, and at once her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When everyone denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds are surrounding you and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." When the woman saw that she couldn't escape notice, she came trembling and fell before Jesus. In front of everyone, she explained why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. "Daughter, your faith has healed you," Jesus said. "Go in peace." As we begin to unpack this text, I think we need to get a good handle on just exactly what is the predicament that she is in. So first of all, we find out that she's bleeding. She's been bleeding for 12 years. This is probably some sort of menstrual disorder. And so if you can imagine suffering physically for 12 long years, and I know some of you in this room are struggling with things that you've been suffering with for that long or even longer. So she's got a physical ailment that she's dealing with. But it's not just that. We need to actually go back and take a look at the impact this is having on her through the lens of the Israelite purity laws. So if you look back in Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 through 31, this is where you have the purity code, and it deals with what happens when women are on their menstrual cycle. And the basic outcome is that they're considered to be unclean. Anyone that they touch then becomes unclean. And if this bleeding continues outside of the normal period for that entire time, the woman is considered to be unclean. So as we think about that, she's also got a social problem, a relational problem. She can't interact with people because she's going to cause them to be unclean. It's highly unlikely that she was married because her husband would be unclean. She probably was unable to have children. She had a very serious social and relational problem, but she also had a spiritual problem as well. Because she was unclean, she was unable to participate in the temple practices. And as we think about that today, we might say to ourselves, well, what's the big deal? She couldn't go to the building, but she could access God in other ways. But that's really a poor way to read this text. It's really reading it through a modern mindset instead of an ancient one, because in that day and time, the temple was the epicenter of God's presence. It's where you went to have the presence of God mediated to you. And so for 12 long years, she had been separated. And if you look back in Leviticus 15, the way that passage ends in verse 31, this is what it says: "You must separate the Israelites from their uncleanness so that they don't die on account of it by making my dwelling unclean, which is in their midst." This was serious business. She had a physical problem, she had a social problem, and she had a spiritual problem. And then you add on top of that the fact that we learned that she had spent all of her livelihood, every last penny that she had, on these doctors, all of whom were unable to heal her. So if you can imagine how vulnerable and desperate she must have been at this point, struggling with this ailment, disconnected from a social network, feeling disconnected from God, having no monetary or financial means to support herself, unable to marry. She is the epitome of desperation at this point. She needs God to step into her life and do something. But it also requires some action on her part. And so she moves into this crowd and she just barely touches the hem of his cloak, and as soon as she does, we learn that the impact was immediate. The bleeding stopped right away. So that's the first thing that happens. The second thing is that it's kind of this disclosure about who Jesus is. I mean, it's almost like this notion that he's the new temple, right? He's the new center of God's presence and power, how it can be mediated to us. But then think about the consequence of what happened to her. When she touched him, what should have happened is it should have made him unclean. But instead of her uncleanness being transferred to him, his wholeness was conferred upon her. It was the opposite of what you would have expected to happen. And then think about the risk that she took in doing this. Venturing into this crowd, everyone's pressing in upon her, everyone that she's touching becomes unclean, and then she dares to touch the cloak of this respected and regarded teacher. I mean, think about the risk of this vulnerable woman and what could have possibly happened to her. So she wants to remain anonymous. She wants to get in and get out of there. And you'd think, okay, great, she's healed. We can go ahead and wrap the story up at this point, we're good. But it doesn't end there. Jesus basically presses for a confession. And we might ask ourselves, why not? Why continue in? Why press in on this? And if you ask me, I think the reason is because her problem was not merely a private one, it was a public one. She didn't need just a private solution, she needed a public solution as well. And so Jesus doesn't let it go. And he says, "Who touched me?" And Peter kind of pushes back on him, "Lord, there are people everywhere, all around you, pressing in on you." And Jesus says, "No, something happened. Power has gone out from me." And so she realizes she's not going to be able to remain anonymous. She's going to have to come forward. And the text tells us that she came forward trembling. And at this point, I think we can imagine why. And so she steps forward and she tells them, she basically lays out the entire reasoning behind why she did what she did. And then she makes this statement, the text says that she was healed. And I want you to just tuck this in the back of your pocket for a second. But the Greek word that's used for healed there is the word iomai. It's just kind of the standard expression for being healed. So the physical issue was taken care of. But then Jesus makes this pronouncement. We get his response from him. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." But the Greek word for that word is actually sozo. It's the word we translate saved. So literally what Jesus is saying, not your faith has healed you, but your faith has saved you. What he's talking about is that there's been a full and a comprehensive salvation that this woman has experienced. She's experienced a physical salvation in terms of the bleeding has stopped. She's experiencing a social salvation. Think about the way Jesus addresses her daughter. Daughter, your faith has saved you. She is welcomed in to the family of faith. And she's now clean, and now everybody knows it. It's now public. She can now go participate with people, but also in the temple. It's a spiritual salvation for her. And I think we can even make an argument that there's at least an economic component here in play. We don't see it totally played out here, but there's at least possibility, there's at least hope for her to not live on the brink of disaster all the time. So when we look at what is biblical salvation, it's everything. God doesn't want to just save part of us in the future. He wants to save all of us, and he wants to begin it now. And we see in this text that there are components that are happening now, and there are some that seem to still continue to be down the road. I think that's true in many of our lives. I think about my own story. My family, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. My dad was Roman Catholic. My mom grew up Protestant. There was a lot of conflict there, and neither of them really thought that faith was a super important thing, so we just didn't go to church. That wasn't a part of our lives, and they said, well, he'll figure out when he wants to and whenever it's time. And so I grew up as a pretty normal kid in Albuquerque, hanging out with my friends, doing all the things that they did. And when I got to high school, at least the friends that I had, Jen, you probably hung out with better people in Albuquerque, but the folks that I hung out with, partying was a big deal. That was what we did. We drank a lot, we tried drugs, we chased after girls, we did all of this stupid stuff. And that was kind of the path that I was on in my life. And then the summer before my senior year happened, and I started to think about all of these decisions that I was making, and I started to wonder to myself, what does God think about all this? I'm pretty sure he's not real happy with the life choices that I'm making, and I'm getting ready to approach graduation. I have no purpose in my life. I always joke that if you talk to my high school teachers and told them that I'm not flipping burgers somewhere, they would be absolutely shocked. I was on a path of just no real purpose. And I look back on that and I think if I continued on that, I really don't know whether I would be alive today or not. But that summer I started asking these questions, and God had strategically placed some people in my lives that were Christians. And they seemed to have this peace in their lives. They seemed to have this purpose that I didn't, but I desperately, desperately wanted. And so I decided that the solution to my problem, at least getting right with God, was that I needed to get baptized. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to meet with this pastor, and I'm going to ask to be baptized. I'll go in that next Sunday. I'll get dunked, punch my ticket to heaven, don't ever have to go to church again. We'll be golden, right? So fortunately, however, I meet with the pastor, and his name is Steve Martin, actually. He's not the comedian. He's actually a professor at Asbury right now. But I meet with Steve. This is like October, and Steve says, sure, I'll be happy to baptize you on Easter Sunday. And so I was like, oh, really? I have to go to boring church, listen to messages like this for 6 months? I'm like, okay, I can do that. We'll be all right. So I started going to church, and as it turned out, there was a guy that I'd grown up playing soccer with, and he wasn't like totally weird. And so I was like, oh, this is great. I can be a part of this. So they invited me on a retreat, and on this weekend retreat in Eastern New Mexico, it was that weekend that I decided to commit my life to Christ and become a follower of his. And everything changed from that point on. And my path was dramatically altered. And I look back now and I think about the beautiful wife and daughter that I have. I think about the calling and the career opportunities, the people and friends in Christ that I've been able to connect with. I think about the blessing. I mean, it's hard to walk with God day after day, but having that connection day after day is just such a saving influence in my life. And I think to myself, God has already saved me from so many things, and I haven't even died yet. So this is my question and our challenge this morning. What aspect of your life do you need salvation in? Is there something that you've been struggling with for year after year, or maybe it's new, I don't know, but what area do you need God to come into your life and bring a holistic salvation? Maybe this is all brand new. Maybe this is your first time and you've been thinking about this. Maybe you've been in the Lord for 40 years and you're just wrestling with something. But I'd like to take just a few moments to just let you reflect in silence and think about, where do you need to invite God into your life? Let's take a moment.